Hey, everybody, this is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I am here speaking with Vivek Murthy. He is a former U.S. Surgeon General and the author of this month's selection, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. So, Vivek, thanks for joining me.
Of course, good to be with you, Jeremy, and hello to everyone who's out there.
Great. Yeah. So glad that you could join us for a quick chat this afternoon. So to get started, I think I have to check in just with you and your family with all this crazy coronavirus stuff going on. How are you doing? Is everyone staying safe?
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, we're doing okay. We normally live in Washington, D.C. My wife and my two kids and I, they're 3 and 2. But we're actually in Miami at the moment, which is where I grew up. And we've been quarantining here effectively for the last few months with my mother, my father, my grandmother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and 3 cats. So it's a full house down here.
It sounds like it. Yeah, I didn't realize that you grew up in Miami. I'm a Florida boy myself. I grew up in Naples.
Oh, how nice. Okay.
Yeah. So, looking at the response that your book has been getting from our community in our member library, as well as in our Facebook group, it seems like your book has really struck a chord with a lot of people. And so I guess before we dive into the content, I just wanted to back up a little bit and ask about your background and how you came to write this book. So yeah, tell us about being a U.S. Surgeon General and how that led to this exploration of loneliness.
Well, this is not the path I expected to go down. Again, this is not the subject I thought I would be talking about at this point. And I also, I never really planned to serve as Surgeon General or to even work in government. That was not where my life was headed. But, sometimes you make plans and sometimes life happens to you. And I realized very early on in my life that those 5-year, 10-year plans that I was trying to make usually got thrown off track within the first few weeks, and I ended up going in a different direction. So I gave up actually making 5-year plans and started to think more so as I was finishing my training, just about what do I want to do next? What would be fulfilling to do next? What would bring meaning to my life and make me want to get out of bed in the morning? And that actually led me to some interesting adventures where after growing up in Miami, I left Florida for college and ended up building some nonprofit organizations that focused on HIV and community health worker models in rural villages in India. Worked on that for about 7-8 years, and ultimately went to med school. Did some time in business school to learn how to build effective organizations because I really liked the nonprofit work I did. And then found myself in residency training, loving medicine, but not knowing what to do after that. And through a long, circuitous journey, recognizing that I was trying to listen more deeply to what I was excited about, even if I wasn't equipped to do it, I realized that I was excited by technology and by social media and about the notion of how to use it to actually improve how we work, how we study medicine, and how we develop therapeutics. So I ended up building a company called Trial Networks to do that after many, many failed attempts along the way at working on ideas. And then, but that was to me an example of how, even though I was totally unequipped to think about technology because I had no background in it, what I found was a general theme in my life is that everything that I have worked on, whether it's the nonprofits that I built or the company or whether it was, the advocacy organization, Doctors for America, I built later, they were all things I actually had no training in doing and had no background in. But I was excited about the prospect of what could be, if these ideas came to fruition. And so I've been fortunate in my life to find friends who are gullible enough to work with me on some of these ideas and help me figure out how to make them a reality. But I was doing all this sort of hodgepodge life when in 2013, the summer 2013, July 10th on my birthday, I remember I had gotten off a red-eye flight and my phone rang. And it was a 202 number, which was Washington, D.C. And I didn't recognize the actual number, but I knew it was Washington, D.C. So I didn't pick it up because at that time, I was actually walking home and my hands were full of dry cleaning. All the dry cleaning had been sitting at the dry cleaners while I was away. And but the phone kept ringing. And finally, I just said, let me pick it up. And that happened to be a call, it turns out, from the White House asking if I'd be interested in being considered for the position of Surgeon General. And It was surprising to me because I had not I had not sought this position out. I didn't want to work in government actually at the time. But two things happened. Interestingly, intuitively in that moment, I had this sense that this was a unique role in government that was unlike most of the other roles in government, one that would actually be a good fit with my interests, with what I hoped would be, a useful skill set, and with this hodgepodge life, that I had developed, where I had some expertise in policy, grassroots organizing, technology, and medicine and public health. And so, last thing I'll say about this, though, is why loneliness, and why did this become an issue of focus? Because I went into my time as Surgeon General, and I even testified before the U.S. Senate during my confirmation hearing with a whole different set of priorities that did not include loneliness or social connection. But what happened to me is that when I began my tenure, I was traveling to towns and cities all across America. And it was in those conversations that I started to hear these threads of loneliness crop up. And it was not explicit. It wasn't like people coming up to me saying, "Hi, I'm Jeremy, I'm Vivek, I'm lonely, I'm struggling with being disconnected." It was not that. It was people usually coming to talk about their struggles with substance use disorders, people who were parents who were worried about anxiety and depression among their kids and worried about how technology was affecting their children. There's people who were concerned about violence in their neighborhoods, chronic disease, like in their own lives. But behind them were these interesting words and phrases people would use. They would say things like, "I feel I have to carry all of these burdens by myself," or "I feel if I disappear tomorrow, no one would even notice," or "I feel invisible." And hearing that again and again and again made me realize there was something deeper happening. It reminded me of my own struggles with loneliness as a child. It reminded me of the loneliness I saw so often in the hospital as a doctor taking care of patients. And I recognized that also, knowing that I had no training really in how to think about loneliness, and I felt I wasn't affording them the kind of support they needed. But all of that together made me realize that loneliness was much more common than I thought. And as I delved into the science, I realized it was also much more consequential for our health as well, increasing our risk of heart disease, premature death, depression, anxiety, dementia, and a whole host of other conditions.
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating because, yeah, I think intuitively a lot of us think that loneliness is primarily a psychological phenomenon. It's not pleasant, but ultimately the effects are kind of localized to our state of mind. But your book is pointing out that it's also a biological phenomenon too, that it really affects our physical well-being. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. Like, how exactly does that work? How is it that our body suffers the effects of loneliness? Oh, are you there? Oh, Vivek, I think you might be muted. Let's see.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I was unable to unmute myself for some reason.
Oh.
No worries. Yeah, it's fascinating, because I think you're right. I think most people do think of loneliness as a bad feeling, but there are real consequences, it turns out, for our health. And this is what I found fascinating. And this is all stuff I did not learn about in medical school because it wasn't part of the curriculum. But it turns out that, thousands of years ago, when we were hunter-gatherers, that we truly understood that there was safety in numbers. When we were together in trusted relationships, we could help protect each other from predators. We could share food and avoid starvation. We could help each other with childcare. We could essentially support each other to live a better life. And when we were separated from our tribe, our chances of survival automatically dropped in a very real way and in a stark way, and we knew that. And so our body immediately went into a stress state when we perceived that we were alone. And that's in that stress state, we were more hypervigilant. We were more focused on ourselves and on our safety. We were more suspicious of what was happening around us, because even if there's a 1% chance that the twig that cracked behind us was a predator, we wanted to interpret it as such because our lives may have depended on it. Now, what's interesting about today is that our circumstances are vastly different.
Let's see. Oh, hang on. I think you might be muted. There we go.
Our circumstances are vastly different than they were thousands of years ago, but our nervous system is actually largely the same. And so when we feel lonely today, even though there's no saber-toothed tiger, at our door waiting for us, we still feel that stress state. And in the short term, it may motivate us to pick up the phone and call a friend or to reach out to a relative. But in the long term, that stress is associated with greater levels of inflammation in our body. It starts to impact and harm, in fact, tissue and blood vessels, and increase our risk of heart disease and other chronic illnesses. And it's in that way that it's likely that loneliness contributes to the kind of chronic illness that we see. One last thing that's worth mentioning about this is how it affects our mental health as well.
Hmm.
Because when you're in a state of hypervigilance for a long period of time, right, that can actually contribute to a sense of anxiety. And what happens when you are hypervigilant is, ironically, you also push people away from you just at the time when you need them. If you've ever been around somebody who seemed excessively focused on themselves, who was somewhat, hypervigilant or more paranoid, if you will, about other people's intentions, somebody who seemed to be aloof, and you figured, they're just, maybe they're full of themselves, they don't want to interact with others. Interestingly, those can all be features of loneliness. And it's paradoxical but it helps us understand why loneliness begets loneliness, and why we can deepen into that sort of vicious cycle, if you will, of loneliness, unless something breaks it. But the last thing, that's important to recognize about mental health is that loneliness also has the effect of eroding our self-esteem. And I say this as somebody who firsthand experienced it as a child, you come to believe over time that you'll be lonely because you're not likable, because you're broken in some way, because you're socially deficient. And as you feel that, then you start to withdraw more. You have less confidence in going up to other people and engaging and taking a risk. So in these ways, we now understand that loneliness absolutely can impact our mental and physical health. So it is far more consequential than the bad feeling that many people thought of it as, for many years.
Right. Yeah, again, just so interesting. And I'd like to start talking about how to break that cycle of loneliness, because we got so many insightful questions from our members who seem to be really curious about this, not only for themselves, but for the people around them. And so one question that kept coming up again and again, for example, is regarding loneliness at the present time, with coronavirus being still very much a thing, and all of us trying to stay inside, away from other people, in quarantine. For example, one member, Lucy McKean, wrote in saying, "I'm particularly concerned about others' loneliness during COVID-19 isolation. I'm happy to have my 2 teenagers, one college age, in my household along with my husband, and we're all getting along very well. But I worry about my friends who are living alone and staying in isolation to avoid catching or spreading the virus." So for members like Lucy, who might be worried about the people around them during this particular time, what would you say to them to help connect with some of these people that might be feeling lonely?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Lucy for that question. And it's wonderful to be concerned about others. And I think there's good reason for concern, because I think during this time when people are not just physically distanced from one another, but when they're dealing with a great amount of fear and uncertainty, that can seriously increase the amount of isolation that people feel in their lives, regardless of how many people may be around them. In this moment, even though you can't reach out and visit somebody as easily as you could have some time ago, there are some things you can do to help connect and support others. So, and I talk about some of these in the actually author's note that we included, in the book at the last minute, because of what was happening with COVID-19. But simply, reaching out by phone or by video conference for 15 minutes, to people in your life, people you care about, can make a big difference for you as well as for that other person. I wanted to say this, with some emphasis, because the amount of time you spend with somebody is not proportionate to the quality of impact. You can make an extraordinary impact on somebody in 30 seconds, in a minute of interaction, if you're fully present with them, if you're listening deeply to what they're saying, if you're showing up with an intention of expressing kindness and compassion. Because all of us as human beings have a few core needs. We want to feel understood for who we are. We want to know that we matter. We want to be loved. All of us have these basic core expectations. And when you pick up the phone or video conference with somebody and you give them the gift of your full attention, what you're saying to them is, I see you. You matter. You're bearing witness to what they're going through. And you can do that with uttering just a few words and spending just a little time. I mention this because I know that so many people's lives are so busy And when we think about how to build a more connected life, sometimes it can feel overwhelming. We could think, oh gosh, do I have to quit my job and move to a new city so I can be close to the people I love? Do I need to, carve out hours and hours a day in my schedule to spend time with family and friends? If you can do those things, then that's wonderful and the power to you. But I want people to know also that just a few minutes of quality time can make an extraordinary difference. The other piece that I'll say, in addition to a little bit of time and high quality time, is to recognize that when we serve others, that is a powerful, powerful antidote to loneliness for ourselves and for the person receiving that service. And service in the age of COVID doesn't have to look like going to a soup kitchen or volunteering at an organization in your neighborhood. It can look like checking in on a neighbor who might be struggling to get groceries because they're worried about their health. It can look like calling up a friend who was struggling with depression or with loneliness long before COVID-19, recognizing that things may be worse. It can look like delivering food to somebody, a coworker who might be struggling to telework and homeschool their kids, or offering to virtually babysit, even for 5 minutes, to give parents a moment to just sit down and take a deep breath and just be for a moment. These are small but powerful acts of service. And when you serve others, it's actually so much more than about what you're actually doing for them. It's more than the time you're creating for them or the food that you're providing for them. It comes back to those core needs. When you serve other people, you are telling them, I see you, you matter, and you are loved. And that is extraordinarily powerful. I want everyone, all of the people who are listening today, but just all of us in the world, to recognize that you don't need an MD or an NP behind your name to be a healer. All of us have the ability to heal and to contribute to others' well-being because we have the ability to give and to receive love. That's what makes us human. It's what makes us healers. And in moments like this, we recognize that we have to lean into that healing capacity, into that power that we have, because there are a lot of people who are hurting. And when we help to heal others, we find that not only do we do better by them, but we in turn help ourselves to feel more connected and more whole.
Wow, that was awesome. I love this idea that we don't need an MD to be healers and to give and receive love in a way that that makes us psychologically and physically healthier. I think that's such a powerful insight. So thank you for that, Vivek. I also wanted to turn to some questions that are applicable and relevant, not only in the time of COVID-19, but really just any time. And so, for example, we had one person write in about becoming a new parent. So Tiffany Elliott says, 3 years ago, my wife and I purchased a new home further from work for more space right before we had a baby. Once the baby arrived, my wife quit her job to be able to stay home with our daughter. But we did not realize how isolated she would feel in a more rural community with no established support groups for new moms. So she says, I will be reading your book from the perspective of how becoming a parent can make you feel lonely and cut off from the outside world at times. I want to understand how I can best help my wife feel more connected and supported within our community. So yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts about that transition from being, all of a sudden, initially it's just you and your partner, and then suddenly you're a new parent, and that comes with all kinds of new responsibilities and maybe a new geographic environment. So yeah, what do you think about loneliness in that context? Like, how does that work?
Well, gosh, this is a really important, and it feels like a very personal question for me as well, because, I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. I still think of myself as a relatively new parent. At least I'm still on that very steep part of the learning curve, and
Sure.
I feel like I'm getting schooled and owned by my kids every day, struggling to catch up.
Yep.
But I do remember how extraordinarily isolating it was actually when we had our first child. And I think a lot of parents feel this kind of loneliness and isolation when they become new parents. They don't talk about it often. One, because of the shame and stigma that surrounds loneliness, but also because it feels ungrateful to say, wow, I've been blessed with this beautiful child, but I'm lonely, and I think some people feel it may seem self-indulgent in some way or ungrateful, but it's really not. In fact, this is a real phenomena that happens. And it's actually shocking that it doesn't happen more often, because if you think about it, your life is suddenly turned upside down. Your evenings are suddenly shifted toward childcare. You're getting up in the middle of the night a lot to take care of your child. So you're probably tired a fair amount, which can make it harder to go out and to, be social in the same way that you may have been before. And the other thing is, if you don't have a lot of other friends who have parents, then suddenly your life circumstances and what you're dealing with, your day-to-day reality is so different from your other friends that it can make it feel like it's hard to relate to them or vice versa. So for all of the reasons that we see, parenthood, and especially new parenthood, can be a really challenging experience in terms of social connection. And the irony is that's happening at a time where we actually need more support than ever before. I think back about the family structures and culture that my parents grew up in India, and how when you had a child then, it was really a family affair, right? Your extended family you often lived with extended family, number one, so there was more support at home. And child rearing was seen as the responsibility not just of a mother and father, but of an extended family. So nieces and nephews and uncles and aunts and grandparents would all contribute to the care of that child and to supporting the parents. And that was an extraordinary thing. And we don't have that nearly as often now. But I will tell you, there are a few times in my life when I have missed my parents as much and my sister as much as when we had our first child. And I just thought, not only, gosh, do we need support, but gosh, it would be so amazing to be able to share some of these joys and these wonderful moments with family. So some things I think that you can do, like in moments like this, is I think, number one, as a spouse, as a friend, as a family member, being able to, number one, acknowledge that new parents may be struggling with this is actually incredibly powerful. Because if you give people space to talk about it, if you ask them, how are you feeling about your life in this moment? Like, are you feeling like it's hard to connect with other people? Are you missing time with friends and family or conversations with others? Opening that door can be extraordinarily powerful, because keep in mind that listening is a powerful way to help heal. The second thing that you can do, though, is if you want to support new parents, is you can show up again in small ways in their life, right? Like we may pre-parenthood, we may have been used to catching up with friends, going out for dinner for several hours and hanging out over a meal and some drinks. But while that may not be as easy during parenthood, even still getting a call from somebody who's a friend, just saying, hey, I'm thinking of you. I want to know how you're doing. Here's a quick update on my life. Here's the thing I also think is powerful in that is to use voicemail, right? We've stopped using voicemail, right? And so what we do is when we call somebody and they don't pick up, we just hang up and we text them, say, hey, just called you, or figure maybe they'll hear a missed call and know that we called. But what we lose when we do that is the extraordinary power of our voice. And when you leave a message for 30 seconds, the same time it would take to type out maybe a text message to tell somebody, hey, I called you, here's what's going on, call me back. There's something beautiful that they gain from hearing the tone of your voice and from the texture of essentially conversation, even if it's one way. And I've started to do that more and more, inspired by a friend who started doing that. Because when I was, especially in the early days of parenthood, we would miss each other a lot because I was up at 3 a.m. He was usually asleep at 3 a.m. And such. But he just started leaving me voicemails saying, hey, his name is Mark. Mark would say, hey, I was just thinking of you. Here's some things that are going on in my life. My daughter did this today. It was really fun. I'm having a hard time at work thinking about this stuff, but I'd really love to catch up with you. I'm wondering how things are going with parenthood, etc. And I would listen to those messages sometimes at 4 a.m. and I'd be like, wow, that's so nice. Like, it's just so good to hear Mark's voice. So never underestimate the power of your voice and showing up in small ways. But the last thing I would say about parenthood is I think that if we really want to build connection during this time of being a parent, and if we recognize also that we don't have, and most of us at least don't have the default extended family structure and community to fall back on, what we have to do is be proactive about making what I think of as a moai. And a moai is a concept I describe in the book. It's a Japanese concept where people come together. And the old traditional Japanese concept, it's early in life when you're a child, and it's brought together by your parents. But they come together with making an explicit commitment to each other to say, look, we're going to go through ups and downs in our life, and we want to make sure that we're there for each other. And it's funny, it sounds so simple. And you might think, isn't that what friendship is about anyway? That you're just there for each other? But what I have found in the modern world is that a little bit of structure and being explicit goes a long way to actually making friendship be what people need it to be. And in my case, at a point when I was really struggling with loneliness, when I had, our son was he's 1.5, just a little over 1.5. And we had just had our daughter as well. And we were so happy and so blessed to have them. But I didn't have much of a community at that time. I had spent all this time in government when I was Surgeon General, focused on work. And I had really, unfortunately, neglected a lot of my relationships. And I came to realize the price I had paid when I came out. And at that time, when I was really struggling, I encountered 2 friends who I love dearly, but rarely ever see. And they were feeling lonely and struggling as well. We made this commitment to each other. We said, once a month, we're going to video conference with each other for an hour. We're going to make sure that we talk about things that are real, that are actually on our mind. We're going to be honest with each other. And the stuff that we normally don't share with friends, like talking about our relationships, our health, our finances, we're going to be open with each other about that. And finally, we're going to reach out to each other in between. If there's something that's bothering us, even if that's sending a text or leaving a voice message, and the rest of us will respond, even if that's with a quick 1 line by message, or if it's getting on the phone real quickly for 2 minutes. But we're going to show up for each other in our lives during this time of need. And I will tell you, Jeremy, that Moai changed my life. It was extraordinarily powerful in helping me feel more connected, but also in helping me make important decisions about being a parent, about my relationships, about work. And so I mentioned these just to say that as challenging as parenthood can be, when we recognize the power of making these kind of explicit commitments, when others recognize the power of giving us a chance to talk about what we're dealing with, and about the power of just reaching out, even for 30 seconds, to say, hello, I'm thinking of you. Don't think of that as 30 seconds of, oh, I just, left a short message. Think of those as lifelines that you are offering to other people. And that's what our relationships are. They're lifelines. They improve our chances of survival. They improve our mental and physical well-being. They improve and increase the joy and fulfillment that we feel in our life.
I love it. That's such powerful insights. Again, really, really like that a lot, Vivek. Thank you. And it strikes me that this is a good opportunity to talk about the different kinds of loneliness, because, I feel like intuitively, we might think, well, I have a great family life, a really great home life, so that should be all I really need, right? I mean, I for example, personally, am not yet a parent, but I remember thinking, even back in college, I was like, man, like I have, really good connections with my mom and dad, and I'm really close with lots of like specific individuals around my college campus, but I don't feel like I have a sense of community anywhere, if that makes sense. There wasn't really like a group that I was a part of that made me like feel good about myself and made me feel like I belonged, I guess. But I remember thinking at the time, like, gosh, like I feel like that's kind of selfish, because like so many people don't have good relationships with their parents, and so many people don't have individual friends to begin with. So who am I to ask for a sense of belonging with a larger community? But your book points out that that type of loneliness is very real, and you can experience, different kinds of loneliness. So yeah, can you tell us exactly about what those are and how they manifest themselves?
Absolutely. And it's such an important question, because if you don't understand the different types of loneliness, then you start to, especially as a spouse, feel that if your partner is lonely, that somehow it's because your relationship is deficient, or it's your fault in some way. But here's what we need to know: the 3 types of relationships, correspond to 3 types of loneliness. And so one is intimate loneliness, when we lack close confidants, a spouse, a best friend, the kind of people with whom we can just purely be ourselves and show up as who we are, and they accept us without judgment. The second type of loneliness is relational loneliness. That's when we lack a circle of friends, the kind of friends with whom we might go out for dinner on the evenings and weekends, people we may go on vacations with, or go to a ball game with, or have over, periodically for a holiday party. And when we lack those kind of friendships, and then, we can feel lonely, even though we have a fulfilling a marriage, perhaps. And the third type of loneliness is collective loneliness. That's when we feel that we lack community. We all want to be a part of something, and affiliation matters. And that affiliation can be achieved in many ways. You can feel like you're part of a community because you have a faith community that you join, and you have a shared set of values and activities you do together. You might be a volunteer, and part of a larger set of volunteers on an organization, for example, and you might care deeply about the mission. You might work for a company that you feel deeply loyal to and feel a sense of community with your other colleagues at work. But however that comes about, we all need that sense of community, of belonging to something larger than ourselves. And when we lack any of these three levels of relationship, we can feel lonely. And it's important to understand that, because if you're a spouse and your spouse is feeling lonely, then it's worth asking and thinking about whether your spouse has a sense of a collective group that they feel they're part of, or an identity, a shared identity. Do they have friends that they're able to spend time with? When I was struggling, in a sense, with loneliness after my time in government, my problem was not that I lacked intimate connections. My problem was I actually didn't have friendships that I was experiencing. And I use this word experiencing very intentionally, because as one of my good friends said to me during that period, she said to me, Vivek, your problem is not that you don't have friendships. It's that you're not experiencing friendships. And that happens to many of us in our life, where we have good friends over the years, but then something happens, we retreat into our cocoon, we move away somewhere, and those friendships become dormant. And so they're just not activated, in a sense. And then the longer it goes and the more that happens, the harder it becomes to reach out. And we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, I don't have, it's going to take an hour or, to actually catch up and have a good conversation. I don't have an hour. Let me just put that off. Maybe I'll call later. And we start to feel lonelier and lonelier. But one of the things, again, coming back to a theme in this conversation, that I had to realize is that I needed to find ways to short circuit that high activation energy to reach out to the friends that I knew I had, but I wasn't actually experiencing those friendships. And sometimes that meant just sending them a quick 2-line text to say, hey, I know I've been gone for a while, but I'm just thinking of you. Sometimes it was literally just picking up the phone and leaving them a voicemail. And however we do it, what we find is if we can push ourselves to overcome some of that activation energy to reach out to other people, we almost always feel better on the other end of it. And they also get far more out of it from hearing our voice, from knowing we're thinking of them, than we sometimes realize.
Yeah, no, I really like that a lot, because I've definitely experienced that myself, where I'm like, oh man, like I'd love to talk to X person, but it's been a really long time. And if I'm going to call them, maybe I should really try to set aside a good hour to talk. But then of course you never do, because it's because there's such a high activation energy, as you say. So I really like that idea of just sending small messages. There was another dimension of this that I really wanted to touch on, because I thought it was such an interesting part of your book. And that's the fact that men and women tend to experience loneliness differently. And, for example, one member wrote in, this is from Giancarlo Satrullo, and Giancarlo says, I have always found it difficult to connect with other men. I don't think there is any one reason, but a large component is prioritizing time allocation to work and family rather than activities with friends or people with similar interests. Personally, I would like to connect with people outside my family, but haven't found the way to do it yet. So, so from your perspective, how is it that men can connect with each other, and how does that differ from how women connect with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, this certainly does, well, a couple of things I'd say about the genders. Like, one is that men and women both experience loneliness at high rates. Some studies show that men may have a slightly higher rate of loneliness than others, but there's some variation. But for the most part, I think it seems that they both experience loneliness at significant rates. With that said, I think that some of the forces that drive loneliness in their lives, while many are similar, there are some interesting and notable differences. I think women tend to be better when it comes to staying in touch with friends, when it comes to being open about how they feel. This is a vast generalization. There are plenty of women who are not like this. And I think over time, things may have shifted, and things differ certainly from culture to culture. But on the whole, one thing that does seem to be true of men is that, especially in the modern world, we have pushed young boys and men to move toward and to live up to a model of masculinity that says real men do the following. They don't express emotions. They don't depend on other people. They certainly never admit to weakness or to fear. And if there is any emotion that's okay for them to express, it's anger, right? Now, think about this for a moment. When you when you tell young men and young boys that that's what being a real man is about, they start to change their behavior significantly. And we actually know this from some research that was done by Niobe Way at New York University, who looked at young boys and how they talked about friendships and found that in elementary school, young boys talk about relationships very similarly to young girls. They'll use language like, I love my friend. I can't wait to hang out with my friend. I can't imagine living without my friends. But as they get older, many girls in adolescence continue to talk about their friends in that way, but boys change dramatically. They won't say, I love my friends. I can't wait to see my friends. I can't live without my friends. It becomes more responses like, it would be cool to hang out with my friends. It's okay. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But this notion of not wanting to show dependence on others, of not wanting to show feelings or express emotions, becomes a predominant way that they operate, because that's what the larger culture around them is telling them men have to do. This becomes really problematic psychologically, because men and women are both feeling and thinking beings, and we feel emotions, we need to express those emotions, and when we don't, they actually cause us harm. And it's why you see so many older men whose loneliness actually is manifest as anger and as irritability. It's one of the things actually I came to realize, which I hadn't in the writing of this book before, which is that, when men get older, there are three big triggers to their loneliness. One is retirement. The second is the loss of a loved one, particularly a spouse. And the third is illness. And when any of those three things happen, because for many men, their cushion in terms of social relationships is thin, they're often relying on their spouse for their social connections to others, then they fall off a cliff, if you will, in terms of their social health. And the way that manifests is often either being really withdrawn or being irritable and angry. And people can look at that and say, oh, they're just, bored, or they're just, getting irritable as they age. And that's just, that's just who they are, etc. But what we don't realize a lot of times is that is a product and the manifestation of the deeper disconnection that they have. And so I think as we think about how to approach loneliness in men and women, like, we have to recognize that some of these differences exist. And we also have to be mindful of the fact that we are in our society increasingly, especially in the workplace, pushing women to be like men in that sense, in that larger stereotype sense. Like, we're telling women in the workplace, you shouldn't show emotion. That's a sign of weakness. You've got to project power. You've got to be the loudest person in the room. And, having worked with many men and women, like in the workplace, like I've found that is actually a harmful model, like to push people toward, because many men and women are not inclined to be like that, right? But we tell them that that's what success is. It's a very male-oriented model around which we build success. And a very masculine sort of like phenotype of success. And I worry that the more we push women to try to be like that, the more we will actually damage their own social and emotional health and lead them to feel more estranged from others. So, so there are real differences here, but I think this is one of the real challenges with loneliness, is to recognize that it's the great masquerader, that it doesn't look like a person sitting alone in the corner in the middle of a party. It can look like irritability and anger. It can look like anxiety or depression. It can look like withdrawal. It can look like that person who's aloof at a party who you think is just full of himself or herself, but in fact might be struggling to reach out. And that aloofness is in fact a defense mechanism because they don't want to be hurt.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess this leads perfectly into another member submitted question, this one from Brian Sano. And he says, in fighting COVID-19, it seems many of the successful leaders in the world have been women, or some men, who led with compassion, kindness, empathy, humility, and vulnerability. My question is, how might we inspire and support people to lead with those qualities and normalize emotions in the 21st century workplace? Because as you were just saying, it seems like we're really pushing this narrative of like, you shouldn't show emotion and you should project power and total independence. So how can we start encouraging people to open up and embrace their emotions and their vulnerability at work?
It's a really good question. And it's a really important question because People spend a third or more of their life at work.
Hmm.
And so if we really want to build a more connected community, if we want to build a people-centered world, we have to recognize that the workplace is a powerful engine through which to do that, as are schools and faith organizations and other community organizations. In the workplace, I think there are a few things that we can do to help build greater connection. And this is actually also important because it's directly relevant to what happens in the workplace in terms of productivity. We know when people struggle with loneliness in the workplace, it decreases their degree of engagement and has downstream effects for their creativity, for their productivity, and for their retention in the workplace. But here are some things I think that can help. So number one, leading by example, especially not just if you're the CEO or if you're a manager, but even if you're a member of that organization, the more that you're able to lead with the kind of people-centered values that say it's okay, to prioritize relationships. It's okay to talk about how we feel. That has powerful ripple effects. And I have seen that so many times in the workplace where one person takes a little bit of risk and shares how they're feeling or in a particular moment about something happening at work or about something going on at home. They choose to be vulnerable in that moment. And that vulnerability gives them power, but it also empowers others around them to share and to be open, to recognize that that's an okay way to be in the workplace. But there are a couple other things I think that can do, which involve using a little bit of structure to create the opportunity to really change how we connect in the workplace. One of them has to do with sharing about our background, right? So we know that when people come to work, that they're more than Jeremy, who's amazing at Excel, or Vivek, who's good at pricing strategy. I'm actually not good at pricing strategy.
I'm not good at Excel, so.
Okay. But people are more than their skill set, and we know that intuitively. But people often don't feel like they have the permission or the safe space in which to talk about or express that other part of who they are. So when we were when I was in government, one of the things that we did in the Office of the Surgeon General is we had a very simple exercise we developed when we realized people were not as connected as they needed to be. And it was called our Inside Scoop exercise. We did this after spending a lot of time trying to organize weekend picnics, happy hours, things which are resource intensive, time intensive, effort intensive. This was actually quite the opposite. This was 5 minutes once a week. And during our all hands meetings, we would ask one person to bring in pictures of any part of their life other than what their current job was. And then we just sat back and listened, the way many of us did in kindergarten during show and tell. And what was really extraordinary about those 5 minutes, Jeremy, is they rapidly became the most important and enjoyable part of people's weeks. Before then, if we tried to cancel an all hands meeting, people would be like, oh, great, I have an hour back in my life, I can do other work. After we started this exercise, if we try to cancel that meeting, they would be held to pay. Everyone was like, no, that's important. That meeting has to stay. That's really important. And it was because of this exercise. People shared all kinds of interesting things. There was a woman who shared, who we thought of as the office nerd, and in an office full of nerds, frankly, myself included. But she was, very studious. She was always, writing really long briefs on every topic and researching every last paper. And so, we had this sort of image of her, but what she showed were pictures of her training for the marathon. And it turned out she was an Olympic level athlete. She had actually qualified for the US Olympic team in long distance running. And she was really a warrior inside, and we had no idea. But it gave us this deeper appreciation for her. It let us see her in a whole new way and connect with her more deeply. The young man who was my aide de camp, who was served in the U.S. Marine Corps for a number of years before joining the U.S. Public Health Service as a lieutenant. Everyone looked at him and thought, well, he's kind of a guy's guy. He's very stoic, always has a crew cut, never expresses any emotions, doesn't talk about his feelings, very regimented in what he does and how he talks to people. And so they figured, the pictures he was going to bring in would be pictures of his time in the Marine Corps. But that's not at all what he shared. What he shared were pictures of his mother and father. He talked about his father, who was an extraordinarily talented musician, and how even though he had passed away, he saw the musical talent of his father living on in his children every time they picked up an instrument. He showed us pictures of his mother and said that his mother was the one who had supported him and his brother, put food on the table, made sure they had an education. And she had done so in very, very difficult and trying times. And in the Marine Corps, when he was deployed on dangerous missions, when he wasn't even sure if he would come back alive at the end of that mission, And when he felt that fear welling up in his stomach, the person he thought of was his mother, because she was his source of strength. She was his rock. And I'll tell you, Jeremy, when we heard that story from Luis, our view of him just changed. You could just see it in people's eyes. He felt so much more human to them. They felt so deeply connected to him because of those 5 minutes of openness and vulnerability. There was no complicated technology involved in this inside scoop exercise. We didn't have to rearrange everyone's schedules and create time away from family and work. This is 5 minutes once a week, but it speaks to the power of a little bit of structure to actually help us share, learn about each other, and forge the kind of deeper connections that makes for more fulfilled and frankly, healthier workplaces.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I like that it also challenges this assumption that many of us have that if we're going to connect with someone or open up to someone, then it needs to be this kind of like spontaneous, organic thing that just kind of emerges, during the day. But you're saying that no, like if you actually put it in your calendar, you actually set time aside for this kind of thing. A lot of the benefits are still there, and you can, help normalize expressing emotions and opening up in a very authentic way, even if it's planned in advance. So I really like that a lot. And we had another question here, which I thought was great, from a member named Chantal Kuhn. So thank you for writing in, Chantal. She says, I'm intrigued by the similarity of loneliness and depression. Having suffered from both, I wonder if it's possible to draw a line between the two. It seems that depression leads to loneliness and loneliness to depression. And the thing that helped me most during my depressive episodes was pushing myself to socialize, especially seeing my friends. So yeah, she's wondering if you could comment on whether it's possible to draw a line between the two and what the causal relationship might be like.
Yeah, that's such an important question. And one of the things that I found in the writing of this book, and why I'm so grateful, Chantal, for asking that question, is that there is a deep interconnectedness between loneliness, depression, and anxiety, particularly social anxiety. And while they're all distinct entities, they all feed off of each other. And so what you find is that when you experience depression, which feels painful, physically feels painful to many people, you start withdrawing more and more from other people. You don't want to interact and go out and have conversations. Everything feels like it takes a lot more effort. And what can happen as a result of that is that you can start spiraling into loneliness as well. Exactly at a time where what you need often is some support and healing connection with other people. So depression can increase our risk of loneliness. And similarly, loneliness can increase our risk of depression, because the lonelier we are, the more we can actually withdraw, because we know about that cycle of loneliness and how loneliness begets loneliness, how it pushes us to turn inward and be hypervigilant. And that can pull down our mood. And if we are struggling with pre-existing depression, or if we have a predilection for it, in some ways many of us do, then that can tip you over, like into a depressive episode. And so it's sometimes hard to pick these apart. But I actually think that at some level, that what I find to be a useful thing to remember is that whether you are struggling with loneliness as your primary challenge or with depression as your primary challenge, that in both cases, relationships and social connection help. They're an important source of healing for us. And what we have to do is also just recognize that if we know in advance that loneliness and depression actually have these downward spirals where they push us to withdraw, then we have to think about the people in our life, who we can be open with about this, so that they can check on us when tough things happen. I was talking to a friend the other day who was sharing with me that she has a dear friend who struggles a lot with depression. And when she stops hearing from him, then she knows, she knows that this is her time to reach out. And the reason I mention this is so often in modern society, where we value people's privacy, et cetera, we tell ourselves, oh, well, I don't know, I don't want to intrude on them if they're not reaching out. Maybe they just want privacy and they want their own time. So let me just give them some space, and when they're ready, they'll reach out. How often do we say that? When they're ready, they'll reach out. let me be first to say that a lot of people will not reach out because even though they need it. And
Right.
what many of us need is somebody who is willing to nudge a little bit, to show up in our life, even when we don't ask for it, right?
Mm.
We do this for our closest family and friends from time to time. And it doesn't mean that you have to intrude in the sense of you have to push yourself on people if they don't want you there. But showing up and saying, hey, I know you haven't answered my phone calls, but I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. I'm worried about you. And I want to support you in any way I can. Saying, we don't have to talk about anything, about what's bothering you. We can just hang out together. We can just watch a movie together. We'll do whatever you want. People in those moments of despair, whether it's driven by loneliness, anxiety, or depression, even though they're withdrawing, they need to know more than ever that there are others who care about them, others who see them, and who recognize that they are still there, that they have value, that they're still a person worth spending time with. I'll lastly share on this front that I remember when I was 18 years old, I remember I was in college. I was with my sister and a few others organizing these HIV/AIDS programs in India, where we would bring students from around the country together and we would do these major trainings and then send them to India. And these trainings were just like these incredibly intense experiences where we'd have like really deep, thoughtful conversations with each other because we were in the trenches, for like the entire summer.
Mm.
And during one of those conversations, I remember asking one of the guys during the 2 a.m. conversation, I said, hey, what do you think a real friend really is?
Mm.
What constitutes real friendship? And he paused for a moment and he said something that I've remembered all the years since then, and will probably remember the rest of my life. He said, a true friend is someone who reminds you of who you are when you forget.
Mm.
And there's something profound in that, which is that in our best moments, we know that we have value. We know that we have worth. We know we have something to bring to the world. But our pain results from those moments when we forget that, when we start to believe that we're unworthy, that nobody would notice if we disappeared, that the world would be no worse off if we just vanished tomorrow. And in those moments, we need people to remind us of who we are. We need people to see us, to tell us that we matter, because we do, not because it sounds good, but because they know in their hearts that we do in fact matter. And that's what friendship is ultimately about. Good friends are like mirrors. They help us see the best of us, even though it may be buried in disappointment or cynicism or grief. And in those moments of depression and loneliness and anxiety, that's why I want to myself commit to showing up more in the lives of my friends, to knocking on that door, and to knowing that even if that door isn't answered, literally or metaphorically, that the knock matters, that showing up in other people's lives has an impact on them. And that's what I think we have to do for each other. And the great power of human connection and the great power of the fact that we are wired to connect as human beings is that a little bit of that knocking, a little bit of that showing up, a little bit of that reaching out to other people can go a long way. It's why when somebody calls now, a good friend, what I used to do before, if I couldn't answer the phone, is I would just, I would decline the call and just text them and say, hey, I'm tied up. But now what I'm trying to do more and more is to pick up that phone and say the same thing in the same amount of time, but to allow myself to hear their voice, to give them a chance to hear my voice. And that 15 seconds of saying, hey, Jeremy, it's so great to hear from you. I can't talk right now, but can I call you back? And for Jeremy to say, oh, of course, no, it's just, I just wanted to catch up with you. Yeah, we can talk anytime. That takes 15 seconds. But that makes such a difference in how we feel because we are wired to connect with one another. And the more we can hear each other's voices, the more we can see each other's faces, the more we can enjoy each other's presence, the more powerful that connection is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's such an insightful point. And it really hits home for me, actually, personally, because one of my closest friends for like ages and ages, I think we met each other in like third grade or something, over the last, like, I'd say probably almost 10 years now. He's been struggling a lot with alcoholism, and he's been sort of in and out of rehab. And His relationship with his family has really been deteriorating lately. But with his most recent trip to rehab, one thing that we did differently this time was that we agreed to talk on the phone every couple of days during his treatment. And so every couple of days, like they took his phone away, so he would have to call me from like the center's phone. But he would call me and we would talk, and it wasn't even really long conversations. It was really only 10 or 15 minutes at a time. But he would just tell me about what type of treatments that he'd been focusing on, and I'd share what had been going on with my life. And as a result, I feel like, hopefully this doesn't turn out to be false optimism, but I don't know. I feel like coming out of that treatment, he sounds better than I've heard him in years, and hopefully just by me being a part of his life during that time, that played a small part in that process. So anyway, all that's to say, I really agree with what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of truth to it.
Jeremy, I strongly suspect that your inclination there is right. I think you did have an impact, because I'll tell you that having spent time with thousands of people over the years who have struggled with addiction to alcohol, to opioids, to other drugs, and having listened to their journeys and understood what helped them come through that dark tunnel of addiction into recovery, nearly every single one of them has said that there was a person or a group of people that they relied on to help them during that journey. It wasn't just about the medications. It wasn't just about the counseling. It was about the community. And those relationships are healing. It's why I think, and why I came to realize after I served as Surgeon General, that if we want to address addiction in our country, if we want to address depression and anxiety around the world, if we want to get to the root of violence, if we want to understand what's driving so much of the political polarization that's afflicting the world today, we have to come back to relationships, to the idea that our greatest source of healing is in fact in our connection with each other. It's what allows us to feel better, to do better, to perform better, and to ultimately live better. And it's why, as I thought about what I could do that would help create a better world for my children and for all the children out there, I kept coming back to this idea that if we can help build a more people-centered world where we prioritize relationships in how we live our lives, in how we design workplaces and schools, and how we even think about public policy and the impact that policy has, then I think that we can be on our way to creating the kind of people-centered society that we truly need. That's where people are stronger, they're healthier, and they're more resilient.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I totally agree. Well, Vivek, I feel like I could talk to you about this for forever, but trying to be mindful of the time here. Maybe just one more question for you, and maybe if you have room in your schedule, in a week or two, we can have one last chat before the community moves on to our next book of focus. But for today anyway, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground talking about loneliness and its connection to our physical health and parenthood and mental illness. But I guess, for right now, for today, is there any final thought that you'd like to leave people with? Something that they can take into their own personal lives and start building a more connected life. Anything like that comes to mind?
Well, first, let me just say, how much I've enjoyed this conversation with you, Jeremy, and the opportunity to focus on a topic like this, which really matters. A few things I would leave people with. One is, I want people to know that if you are struggling with loneliness, that you are not alone, that there are many people who are, and in fact, loneliness is a natural human experience that all of us go through at some point in our life. So your loneliness is not evidence that you're broken in some way or that you're deficient. The second thing I want to be clear on is that we can, in fact, address loneliness and build a more connected life. And it can happen through the small steps that we take that can make a big difference. It's in the few minutes that we take to pick up the phone when someone calls, the few minutes we take to check up on someone who might be struggling or might be having a great time, but just with someone with whom we want to connect. It's in the few minutes that we also take to protect solitude in our lives, recognizing that solitude is when we ground ourselves and connect more deeply with ourselves, whether we're spending a few minutes in nature or in meditation or in prayer or remembering 3 things we're grateful for. And when we approach other people with that sense of groundedness and centeredness and calm, we're better able to listen to them, to be fully present, and to connect deeply with them. And solitude doesn't have to be a 7-day retreat that we take from our families. It can be 5 minutes on our front porch, feeling the breeze against our face or taking a walk in nature, or 5 minutes spent remembering 3 things we're grateful for or meditating. But in these small ways, we can start to build a much deeper sense of connection in our lives. And to me, that is incredibly reassuring. We don't have to transform everything to experience deeper connection. But the last thing I would just leave you with is this. Where does this fit in our lives in terms of priority? And as a society, like we're dealing with so many things, challenges from COVID-19 to chronic illnesses to political polarization. And one might rightly ask the question, is social connection the issue to focus on in this moment? What I would say is that this is in fact the issue that I think we have to focus on because it connects to everything else. Because when we are connected to each other, we can listen to each other more deeply. We can dialogue more effectively. We can come together to solve the big problems we're facing, whether it's COVID-19 or climate change or inequities in health or economic inequality. All of these things take dialogue, which takes human connection. And the truth is we've allowed our connection with each other to deteriorate over the last several decades. It's been well documented that social capital has declined during that time. But it hasn't happened because people think relationships are bad. It's happened more out of neglect, because we have in many ways taken connection for granted and said, well, that's what people do. We're going to stay connected to each other. It turns out that we need to do more. And so if we want to build healthier workplaces, if we want schools that ultimately recognize that giving kids a foundation for healthy relationships and connection is as important to their success in the world and their health as anything else, then we've got to make human connection a priority in how we think about our lives and in how we think about society more broadly. So this is, in fact, I think the issue, the central issue of our time. And I will say that there was no issue that I talked about and worked on during my time as Surgeon General that resonated as deeply and as viscerally with people across ages, across the political spectrum, across geographies, than this issue of loneliness and social connection. Because I think we all feel it. Many of us know that our lives might be better off with deeper connection. We might be worried that we're the only one. We may be worried that we don't know how to strengthen that connection, but many of us are concerned about it. So as we set forth in our lives to build more connected experiences, to strengthen our relationships and double down on our commitment to each other, let's just remember that our connections are the foundation on which we build everything else. And as we foster that connection, we help not only ourselves, but the other people in our life who are often struggling and looking for deeper connection as well.
That's such a beautiful sentiment to end on. Vivek Murthy, thank you so much for writing this book. Everybody, as you know, it is together. Be sure to finish it if you haven't already. It's really excellent from cover to cover. And like I said, maybe we can do one more of these before the end of the month. But for today anyway, Vivek Murthy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks everyone for joining. And thank you for reading the book.